Aaliyah grew up in a small town where ambition was often treated as arrogance, especially for someone like her. She was quiet, observant, and fiercely determined, but to many people in her community, she was just another black girl from the wrong side of town. Her family lived modestly. Her mother worked double shifts as a nurse. Her father fixed cars in their front yard to make ends meet. They didn't have much, but what they did have was love, hope, and the belief that education could change everything. From a young age, Aaliyah dreamed of becoming a lawyer. While other kids played dress-up, she spent hours pretending to argue cases in front of a mirror, using a hairbrush as a microphone and her mother's worn Bible as a law book. She loved the idea of justice, of giving a voice to those who were ignored or silenced. But high school had a way of crushing dreams. It started subtly, whispers, side glances, quiet laughter when she spoke too confidently in class. Most teachers ignored it, brushing it off as teenage teasing. But one teacher, Mrs. Coleman, seemed to take particular pleasure in reminding Aaliyah of her place. Coleman had been teaching English for over 20 years, and she ruled her classroom with cold authority. Her tone was always sharp, her patience thin. She seemed to favor the wealthier, lighter-skinned students, the ones whose parents she played tennis with on weekends. Aaliyah tried to impress her. She studied harder, stayed after class to ask questions, volunteered to read out loud, but nothing she did was ever good enough. Mrs. Coleman graded her essays harshly, often accusing her of plagiarism whenever her writing sounded too sophisticated. Then came the day that would scar Aaliyah forever. It was career day, the moment every student shared their dreams for the future. When it was Aaliyah's turn, she stood up proudly and said she wanted to be a lawyer. Her classmates laughed. But it was Mrs. Coleman's smirk that stung the most. That day, the teacher didn't just dismiss her dream. She dismantled it. She told Aaliyah that law required a certain kind of intelligence, that people like her didn't usually make it far in that field, that maybe she should set her sights on something more realistic. The words cut deep. They echoed in Aaliyah's head long after the laughter faded. She went home that day silent, tears rolling down her face as her mother cooked dinner, unaware that her daughter's confidence had been quietly shattered in a single afternoon. From that point on, Aaliyah changed. She stopped raising her hand. She stopped volunteering, her grades slipped. Teachers whispered that she wasn't applying herself. No one asked why. No one cared. But one night, as she sat in her small bedroom surrounded by textbooks and unfinished homework, she opened her notebook to a blank page and wrote something across the top in bold letters, "Prove her wrong." That night became a turning point. Aaliyah began studying in secret. She'd sneak into the local library after school, spending hours reading about constitutional law, famous trials, and civil rights cases. She watched online lectures late into the night, her tired eyes burning under the dim light of her desk lamp. Every insult, every condescending smirk from Mrs. Coleman became fuel. Her classmates went to parties. Aaliyah went to war with herself, with her fears, and with the system that kept trying to remind her of where she belonged. Slowly, her grades improved again. Not enough for anyone to notice. Not yet, but enough to remind her that she wasn't broken. Then came senior year, college application season. Guidance counselors encouraged the top students to apply to big universities, while others were quietly funneled toward community college or trade school. When Aaliyah mentioned wanting to apply to law programs, Mrs. Coleman laughed again, this time in front of the entire class. "She's not serious," the teacher said, waving her hand dismissively. "Law school isn't for dreamers." The humiliation burned deeper than before, but Aaliyah didn't argue. She had learned that some battles weren't worth fighting, not yet. Instead, she applied in silence. Every essay, every form, every recommendation letter became another quiet act of rebellion. She poured her pain into her personal statement, writing about resilience, injustice, and the power of perseverance. Months later, while sorting mail one cold December morning, she saw the envelope, thick, white, and stamped with the name of her dream school, Howard University. Her hands trembled as she tore it open. When she read the word, "Congratulations," tears streamed down her face. But even in that moment of triumph, a small, bitter thought crept in. Mrs. Coleman will never believe this. And in that single thought lay the seed of something greater, a silent promise that one day she would make the woman who doubted her see exactly who she had become. Years later, when Aaliyah sat in her first law class, Surrounded by students from wealthy families and prestigious prep schools, she felt that same familiar isolation. She was the only black woman in her section. Professors often mistook her for a scholarship student. It didn't matter. She'd learned long ago that validation wasn't given. It was earned. Every late night study session, every mock trial, every internship, she carried Mrs. Coleman's voice in the back of her mind, not as a wound anymore, but as motivation. Still, there were moments when she doubted herself, when the system seemed too big, too biased, too unyielding, when professors overlooked her, when classmates formed study groups and conveniently forgot to invite her. But every time she felt like giving up, she remembered that 17-year-old girl sitting in a high school classroom, listening to her teacher tell her she'd never make it. And every time she whispered silently to herself, "Watch me." Years later, after passing the bar and working her way up through countless courtrooms, something unexpected would happen. Something that would bring her face to face with the woman who once crushed her dreams. The universe, it seemed, had a strange sense of timing, because one morning, Aaliyah would walk into a courtroom, not as a student, not as an intern, but as a full-fledged attorney, and sitting on the witness stand would be none other than Mrs. Coleman herself. And for the first time, their roles would be reversed. Years had passed since that day in high school, but the memory of Mrs. Coleman's words still lingered in Aaliyah's mind like an old scar, healed, but never forgotten. Life had taken her far from the small town that tried to contain her. She was now a practicing attorney, working for a respected firm in the city. Her name was etched on polished glass doors, her suits were sharp, her tone confident, and her record impeccable. She had done it, built everything they said she couldn't. But success, as Aaliyah had learned, was rarely smooth. Even after passing the bar with top marks, she faced bias in every corner of her professional life. Clients sometimes mistook her for the assistant. Older lawyers dismissed her as too young. Judges gave her skeptical looks when she introduced herself in court. Each slight was a reminder that the prejudice she fought in high school had merely changed its shape. Quieter, subtler, but just as sharp. Still, Aaliyah stood firm. She had built her resilience brick by brick until it became an unbreakable fortress. Every case she took, every client she defended, was another testament to her strength. She'd promised herself long ago that she wouldn't just be a good lawyer. She would be undeniable. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when fate decided to test that promise. Her firm had assigned her a new case, a civil matter involving workplace discrimination. The plaintiff was a middle-aged woman suing a local private school for wrongful termination and harassment. Aaliyah didn't think much of it at first. Another case. Another chance to fight for someone who had been mistreated. She reviewed the file carefully, scanning through documents and witness lists. But then, as her eyes landed on one name, her heart stopped. Defendant Coleman, Marjorie. She froze. The air around her seemed to thicken. The name was too familiar. She checked again, her pulse quickening. The details matched. The age, the location, even the handwriting on the original employment forms that were attached as exhibits. It was her. Mrs. Coleman. Aaliyah leaned back in her chair, staring at the name as memories flooded her mind. The laughter, the humiliation, the cold smirk that once made her feel so small. The same woman who had mocked her dream was now being accused of discrimination herself. Poetic justice. Aaliyah felt a storm of emotions, disbelief, anger, satisfaction, and something else she couldn't quite name. This wasn't just coincidence. This was karma walking into her life, uninvited but perfectly timed. The next week, Aaliyah walked into the courthouse for the pre-trial hearing. The marble floors echoed beneath her heels as she stepped into the courtroom. Confident, composed, professional. Her client sat beside her, nervous and trembling, but Aaliyah's calm presence seemed to steady her. Then the door opened behind them, and there she was, Mrs. Coleman. She looked older now, her once perfectly styled hair streaked with gray, her posture less rigid, her face worn with fatigue. But those eyes, cold, sharp, calculating, were unmistakable. Aaliyah's breath caught for a moment. She wondered if Mrs. Coleman would recognize her, maybe not. Years had passed and time had changed them both. Aaliyah was no longer the shy, unsure girl she used to be. But as Mrs. Coleman's gaze swept across the room and landed on her, something flickered in her expression. Confusion, recognition, then disbelief. Yes, she remembered. Aaliyah didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her presence said enough. The irony of the moment was almost unbearable. The woman who once said Aaliyah wasn't smart enough to be a lawyer now sat in front of her, vulnerable, accused, and facing judgment. As the proceedings began, Aaliyah focused on the facts, not the past. Her professionalism was unshakable, her questions precise, her demeanor controlled. But beneath the surface, she felt a powerful current of emotion. Justice, long delayed, quietly unfolding before her eyes. The more she learned about the case, the more the parallels grew. Mrs. Coleman had been accused of treating minority staff members unfairly, making biased remarks, passing over qualified employees, fostering a hostile work environment. The evidence was damning. Aaliyah found herself torn between satisfaction and sadness. This was the same behavior she had endured as a teenager. The same arrogance, the same superiority masked as discipline. But now Mrs. Coleman was the one being held accountable. Still, Aaliyah wasn't a vengeful woman. She believed in justice, not revenge. And justice, she knew, required restraint. After the hearing ended, she walked past Mrs. Coleman without a word. But as she did, she saw something unexpected. Fear. The once dominant teacher now looked small, unsure, almost desperate. It was a strange feeling, to see the person who once had so much power over her now stripped of it entirely. That night, Aaliyah couldn't sleep. She sat by her window listening to the rain, staring at the city lights below. Her thoughts spiraled. Was this fate giving her a chance to get even? Or was it offering her a chance to prove she was better than the bitterness that once consumed her? She thought of her mother, of all the sacrifices that had brought her here. She thought of the young students she mentored now. Kids who looked like her, who carried the same quiet fire in their hearts. Maybe this wasn't about revenge at all. Maybe it was about closure. But still, part of her wanted Mrs. Coleman to know exactly who she was. To look her in the eye and realize that the girl she once dismissed had become the very thing she said she'd never be. Aaliyah knew the trial would begin soon. And in that courtroom, under the eyes of the law and the weight of truth, Mrs. Coleman would finally face the consequences of the prejudice she had spread for years. Aaliyah would be there to see it happen. Not as a victim, not as a student, but as a voice for justice. The girl who was told she would never make it was about to cross paths with her past one final time. And this time, she would be the one in control. The day of the trial dawned gray and heavy, as if the sky itself understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. The courthouse loomed tall and imposing against the skyline, its cold stone facade reflecting decades of judgment, truth, and consequence. For Aaliyah, walking through its doors that morning felt different than ever before. This wasn't just another case. It was the collision of her past and her present. She arrived early, as always. The courtroom was still empty, the polished wooden benches lined neatly, the judge's bench casting its silent shadow over the room. She placed her files on the table, her motions prepared, her arguments memorized. Every document, every fact, every witness statement had been combed through meticulously. She had spent nights rehearsing, not because she doubted her skill, but because this case meant more than just winning. It meant healing. As people began to trickle in, the tension grew thicker. The plaintiff, a woman named Rachel Torres, sat nervously beside Aaliyah, her hands clasped tightly together. Rachel had been a teacher at the same private school where Mrs. Coleman once ruled with an iron hand. The evidence painted a clear picture of a toxic environment, biased performance evaluations, racial slurs disguised as jokes, and years of being overlooked for promotions she rightfully earned. And at the center of it all stood the same woman who had once told a teenage girl she wasn't good enough to pursue law. When Mrs. Coleman entered the courtroom, the energy shifted. The years had aged her, softening some edges but hardening others. She walked with a kind of forced dignity, her head held high, though the faint tremor in her hands betrayed her nerves. Her lawyer, a polished man in his 50s, guided her to the defendant's table. She avoided looking in Aaliyah's direction, but Aaliyah didn't need her acknowledgement. Her presence alone was enough to make the past come alive in that silent room. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The trial had begun. Opening statements were delivered with poise and precision. Aaliyah's words flowed with calm conviction, every sentence carefully constructed. She painted a picture not of vengeance, but of truth, of a pattern of discrimination that had destroyed careers and confidence alike. Her voice never wavered, even as she felt the weight of old wounds pressing at the edges of her composure. Mrs. Coleman's attorney countered with smooth confidence. arguing that Rachel's termination was due to performance issues and not bias. But as the witnesses took the stand, the cracks in their defense began to show. Former employees described Mrs. Coleman as controlling, dismissive, and prone to favoritism, particularly toward white staff. One by one, stories emerged of her subtle cruelty, the same kind Aaliyah had known as a student. The courtroom filled with whispers, side glances, and the palpable sense of a reputation unraveling. Through it all, Aaliyah remained composed. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk. She simply let the truth do its work. But when Mrs. Coleman was finally called to the stand, the air turned electric. Aaliyah stood, walking toward the witness box with quiet authority. The rhythm of her heels on the marble floor echoed through the room. As she stopped in front of Mrs. Coleman, their eyes finally met. The teacher and the student, years and miles apart, now bound together again by fate and justice. Aaliyah asked her questions calmly, each one measured, deliberate. Had she ever made remarks about a teacher's background or appearance? Had she ever questioned an employee's intelligence based on where they were from? Had she ever told anyone that some people just aren't cut out for certain professions? Mrs. Coleman hesitated, stammered, and tried to deflect. Her attorney objected repeatedly. But Aaliyah was relentless, not cruel, but unwavering. The courtroom could feel it. This was more than just cross-examination. This was the truth being unearthed, layer by painful layer. At one point, Mrs. Coleman's gaze hardened. She recognized her own reflection in Aaliyah, the young woman she once underestimated. And for the first time, her composure cracked. Her voice trembled. Her hands shook. The confident teacher was gone, replaced by a woman haunted by her own past actions. When Aaliyah finished her questioning, she returned to her table without looking back. She didn't need validation. The truth had already spoken louder than anything else could. The courtroom sat in silence as the judge called for a recess. People whispered, some in awe, others in disbelief. Aaliyah stepped outside into the crisp air, closing her eyes and breathing deeply. For the first time, she felt a strange calm settle over her. She thought back to that classroom years ago. The smell of chalk, the laughter of her classmates, Mrs. Coleman's voice slicing through her confidence. She realized something profound. That moment hadn't defined her. It had forged her. Still, the trial wasn't over. There was one more day of testimony, one more chance for Mrs. Coleman's side to defend her actions. Aaliyah knew they would come hard, trying to twist the narrative to paint her client as overly sensitive or difficult. It was the same pattern she had seen her whole life. Discredit the victim, protect the powerful. But this time, justice had someone strong enough to stand up to it. As she walked back into the courthouse, a light drizzle began to fall, tapping softly against the windows. It reminded her of all those nights she had cried after being told she wasn't enough, of the rain that used to feel like her only witness. Now, that same rain sounded different, like applause, quiet and steady. Inside, Mrs. Coleman sat with her head bowed, her once firm shoulders sagging. The courtroom buzzed faintly around her, but she seemed lost in her own thoughts. Maybe she was finally realizing the damage her prejudice had caused, not just to others, but to herself. The next day would bring the verdict. Aaliyah knew that whatever happened, this chapter of her life, the one written in pain and perseverance, was about to close. But deep down, she also knew something else. That closure isn't about revenge or victory. It's about reclaiming the power that was once taken away. And tomorrow, when the final judgment was read, she would see just how far she had come. From a silenced girl in a classroom to the woman commanding a courtroom. The world had turned full circle. The courthouse was silent the next morning. The kind of silence that carried weight. Heavy, expectant, charged with the tension of everything unsaid. Outside, the sun barely pierced through the gray clouds, bathing the steps in pale light. Inside, Aaliyah sat at her table, hands folded neatly on her files, her expression calm but unreadable. The long hours, the testimony, the pain. It all came down to this moment. She had been in dozens of trials before, but this one was different. This wasn't just about a case. It was about closure. It was about reclaiming her story from the person who had tried to write it for her years ago. The courtroom slowly filled with spectators, fellow teachers, journalists, curious locals. The energy buzzed faintly, whispers rippling through the crowd like static. Everyone knew what this case represented: a reckoning, both legal and moral. Rachel Torres, Aaliyah's client, sat beside her. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her notepad, eyes fixed on the front of the courtroom. Aaliyah leaned back slightly, exuding quiet strength. She knew Rachel needed to see that calm, to borrow it, to breathe it in. Then the door opened. Mrs. Coleman entered. For a brief second, time seemed to pause. Gone was the commanding teacher who once walked with her chin high, her presence loud and sharp. Now she was smaller, slower, her eyes tired and glassy. The arrogance that once defined her had drained away, replaced by something fragile. Fear. She avoided looking at Aaliyah, but her trembling hands betrayed everything. When the judge entered, the murmurs died instantly. Everyone stood, then sat again, the sound of chairs scraping across the polished floor echoing through the chamber. It was time. The jury filed in, their expressions solemn. The foreperson carried a folded sheet of paper, the verdict form. Aaliyah could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. For a moment, she wasn't in that courtroom. She was back in that high school classroom, sitting under fluorescent lights, listening to Mrs. Coleman's voice cut her down. But this time, the power was hers. The judge's voice broke the silence. Has the jury reached a verdict? A collective breath filled the room. Yes, Your Honor, the foreperson replied. The paper was handed over, unfolded, and read aloud. Each word seemed to stretch out, echoing like a drumbeat. The verdict was in favor of the plaintiff, Rachel Torres. Coleman was found guilty of discrimination and wrongful termination. Damages awarded substantial. A hush fell over the courtroom. Then a soft gasp. A few quiet claps broke out before the judge silenced them with a look. Aaliyah felt something inside her uncoil. Years of tension, of doubt, of quiet rage, dissolving into something lighter. Not triumph exactly, but peace. She glanced toward Mrs. Coleman. The older woman sat frozen, her mouth slightly open, eyes wide with disbelief. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but she didn't respond. Her gaze drifted to Aaliyah, finally meeting her eyes. For a fleeting second, the mask fell away. A lifetime of superiority stripped bare. What remained was just a woman, flawed, human, small. Aaliyah didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply nodded once, a gesture not of victory, but acknowledgement. Because in that moment, she realized something profound. She had already won long before the verdict. The real victory wasn't the judgment or the damages. It was standing there, in that courtroom, in her own power, as the embodiment of everything Mrs. Coleman said she could never be. The judge dismissed the court. People began to file out, buzzing with murmurs and speculation. Reporters gathered near the steps, waiting for a statement. Rachel turned to Aaliyah, tears in her eyes, whispering her thanks through trembling lips. Aaliyah placed a steady hand on her shoulder. Justice had been served, not perfectly, not completely, but meaningfully. As they exited the courthouse, flashes from cameras filled the air. The story would make headlines. Teacher found guilty of discrimination. Former student turned lawyer wins landmark case. The world would call it poetic justice. But Aaliyah didn't crave the spotlight. What she craved was quiet, the peace that comes after surviving a storm. That evening, she returned to her apartment overlooking the city. The skyline shimmered with gold as the sun dipped below the horizon. She took off her blazer, loosened her hair, and stood by the window, letting the fading light wash over her. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel everything, the hurt, the anger, the long years of pushing forward. She thought of her younger self, that high school girl who once cried herself to sleep after being told she'd never make it. If only that girl could see her now. But beneath the calm, another feeling stirred, curiosity. She couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Coleman's face in that final moment. The defeat, yes, but also something else. Regret. It lingered with her, hauntingly so. Because as much as Mrs. Coleman had wronged her, Aaliyah couldn't help but wonder what happens to people like her after their downfall. Did they learn? Did they change? Or did they just crumble under the weight of their own bitterness? Days later, her curiosity would get an unexpected answer. Because just when Aaliyah thought the story was over, that the past had finally been put to rest, she would find an envelope waiting for her on her office desk. No return address, no markings except her name handwritten in shaky cursive. When she opened it, her breath caught. Inside was a letter signed Marjorie Coleman. The morning the letter arrived, the world outside Aaliyah's office window felt unusually still. The city hummed as it always did, cars honking, heels clicking, the faint buzz of ambition. Yet everything in her office seemed to pause the moment she saw that envelope. Her name was written across it in cursive, slightly shaky, as if the writer's hand had trembled with hesitation. The paper itself was old-fashioned, ivory-colored, the kind you'd expect from someone who still believed in manners and stationery. But there was no return address, no stamp of formality. Just 2 words on the front for Aaliyah. She turned it over slowly, her chest tightening. She already knew who it was from. Coleman. For a few seconds, Aaliyah just stared at it, unsure if she wanted to open it at all. She had spent years burying the pain this woman caused her, transforming it into drive, purpose, and success. Now, after everything, the humiliation, the trial, the verdict, Mrs. Coleman's handwriting sat on her desk like a ghost from another life. Part of her wanted to throw it away, to treat it as nothing more than an afterthought. But another part, the part that still believed in understanding, in truth, reached for the letter opener. The envelope tore open with a soft rip. Inside was a folded piece of lined paper, creased neatly, written in blue ink. The first line made her breath catch. "I know I have no right to ask you to read this." The letter was long, raw, stumbling, desperate. Coleman admitted that she had recognized Aaliyah the moment she stepped into the courtroom. She confessed that for years, she had tried to forget the things she said in that classroom, tried to convince herself that her comments had been taken the wrong way. But the truth, she wrote, was that they had haunted her. She wrote about her upbringing, how she was raised in a family that quietly believed in hierarchy and superiority, how those beliefs had been passed down, dressed up as standards and discipline. She wrote about how she had once taken pride in pushing students hard, but deep down, she knew she treated some more harshly than others. "When I saw you standing there as a lawyer, it was like facing everything I've ever done wrong in my life. You were everything I told you you'd never be, and that broke something in me." Aaliyah read in silence, her emotions twisting and shifting. The words weren't polished or perfect. They were messy, honest, written by someone stripped of pretense. Mrs. Coleman described how her world had fallen apart since losing her job, her marriage strained, her reputation gone, her health declining. She didn't blame anyone but herself. But more than anything, she said she was sorry. Not just for the case, but for the years before it. "I used to tell myself that I was shaping young minds, but I was really breaking them. And I broke yours. You didn't deserve that. You were bright. You were brave. And I was too blinded by my own pride to see it." The letter ended simply, "If you never forgive me, I'll understand. But please know, you taught me more than I ever taught you." By the time Aaliyah finished reading, the edges of the paper were damp where her fingers had trembled against it. She sat still for a long while, staring at the city skyline outside her window. Forgiveness had always been an abstract idea to her, something she believed in theoretically but rarely practiced. She'd built her success not on forgiving the past but on outrunning it. And yet, as she read Mrs. Coleman's shaky handwriting again, something inside her began to soften. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't pity. It was understanding. People could change. It didn't erase the pain they caused, but it mattered that they tried. Still, she didn't know what to do. Should she respond? Ignore it? Confront her in person? She folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it in her drawer. Then she went on with her day, meetings, clients, phone calls. But the words lingered in her mind like a quiet melody she couldn't shake. That night, she found herself unable to sleep. The city lights glowed faintly through her curtains. She thought about Mrs. Coleman, the stern face behind the teacher's desk, the sharp words that once shattered a teenage girl's dream. She imagined her now, alone in a small apartment, writing that letter by lamplight, hands trembling with guilt. Maybe this was karma. But maybe it was something deeper, the universe forcing both of them to face what they'd been avoiding for years. By morning, Aaliyah made a decision. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't even draft a response. Instead, she looked up the return address from the court records, the one Mrs. Coleman had used during the trial. A week later, she found herself parked outside a modest apartment complex on the edge of town. It was nothing like the pristine suburban home Mrs. Coleman once boasted about in class. The building was small, faded, and quiet. For a moment, Aaliyah considered leaving. Maybe it was enough to have read the letter. Maybe seeing her again would only reopen old wounds. But something compelled her to step out of the car. Maybe she wasn't looking for closure. Maybe she wanted to see what remorse looked like in the flesh. She walked slowly up the steps, her heels clicking against the worn concrete. When she reached the door marked 3B, She paused, her heart pounding. She raised her hand to knock, but before she could, the door creaked open slightly, revealing the frail figure inside. It was Mrs. Coleman. She looked up, startled, eyes widening in disbelief as they locked onto the young woman standing before her. And in that instant, with the past standing face to face with the present, both women knew that whatever came next would change them forever.